Today on the show, we are going to be talking about can trendy diets lead to performance deficits in athletes? And I have two very exciting guests. So we have Zoe Rome and then Kylie Van Horn, and they actually have a podcast called Wait for It. Your diet sucks. And I would love to hear about that. So, Kylie is actually a sports dietitian. Zoe comes in from the journalism and food world. So, ladies, let's start by just having you introduce yourselves and of what you do. Tell us a little bit about your podcast, and then we will rock and roll into trendy diets, how that affects athletes, especially right now as we're going into January. Very timely for everyone, not just athletes.
Thanks for having us. As you mentioned, Kylie Van Horn, I am an endurance sports dietitian. So I work with a lot of runners and cross-country skiers, cyclists, triathletes, on their nutrition. And I'm the owner of Fly Nutrition. I work virtually with athletes and just actually finished a book, Practical Fueling for Endurance Athletes, which is coming out in March. And it's a really great resource for people to look at like tips on
Yeah.
how to fuel yourself versus just like straight information.
Love that. Congrats on the book.
Yeah,
That's an endeavor. I
yeah,
know.
it is.
Awesome. And but so helpful for that community that I think often really wants to know about sports nutrition. So that's awesome.
Hmm.
All right, Zoe.
Hi, I'm Zoe Rome. I'm a journalist, podcaster, author, comedian, ultra runner. I like running really long distances and writing and researching about food, science, and the environment. I started working at NPR in podcast development, editing, and production, then moved on to Outside Magazine, and this summer started this podcast with Kylie because we were looking around. We were like, man, there's just not a lot of really good resources for athletes that both feel fun and like approachable and also are evidence-based. There's a lot of interviews out there, and I'm always so suspicious when people are doing interviews and not leaning as heavily on like research and evidence and like having experts on rather than just
Hmm.
athletes sort of bringing their own anecdotal N of one evidence. And IRL, Kylie and I are just best friends.
Love
We
it.
run together all the time. We hang out all the time. And I am always, always, always picking Kylie's brain about food and nutrition science. And so I thought, what the heck, might as well turn a microphone on and capture some of these questions because if I, a person that has like a degree in science communication, feel confused and lost and overwhelmed by all the information out there, then I'm sure I'm not alone. So hopefully in being like vulnerable about my own mistakes and misunderstandings and sort of
Mhm.
looking to Kylie to help me understand why things work the way they do, and then looking to the history and the culture and the research for helping inform the science, we thought that that would be a useful resource for other
Yeah.
athletes out there.
100%. Okay, such a great lead in. So let's start to talk about trendy diets. So in your each of your opinion, like as we talk about for either younger athletes, like high school kids, college kids, etc., why do we think trendy diets are so appealing to that age group? And then Kylie, I know you do a lot in social media, and then obviously Zoe, you're in the whole journalism world. How do we think social media really influences that when we're talking about, Zoe, what I like to call bro science, right? People just
Yeah.
saying, I always joke and I always just say everyone eats, so everyone has an opinion on it. Like, not everyone is an architect. They're not like judging the arc of a building. Like, why did they make it like that? But because people eat, they assume
We
they
all
know.
think we're experts because we
Oh,
do it three
yeah.
times a day, and we might be experts about a lot of things about our own
Yep.
body, but unfortunately, some of us will extrapolate that far past the point at which we should and start to
Yes.
think we might be experts about other folks' bodies, and that's where things get really, really tricky. And I think that athletes are really susceptible to trendy diets because they promise quick results,
Yep.
whether it's weight loss, performance gains, maybe an aesthetic goal. These are really attractive ideas, particularly for young people or athletes who are really looking to gain a performance edge. And social media is definitely feeding this fire because platforms like TikTok, Instagram, podcasts even can really amplify the voices of influencers, often who don't have scientific or
Right.
evidence backed sort of points. And studies actually show that social media increases exposure to misinformation with teens and young women, particularly just because there's more young women on social media being
Hmm.
especially vulnerable because of their developmental age, their exposure to these topics. And there was actually a study that came out in JAMA Pediatrics that found that teens exposed to social media diet trends were at a significantly higher risk for disordered eating patterns. And so there's a
Interesting.
huge intersection between like so many young athletes really want to do well and they want to perform their best. But unfortunately, when it sort of gets mixed into the toxic soup
Yeah.
of social media and just the fact that, when you're young, you don't have as much experience with
Right.
knowing the downsides of some of these decisions, it can make it really hard to understand what to do when you do want to perform your best in your sport.
Well,
Yeah,
and
I
I
think,
think,
yeah, go
oh,
ahead. No, go
sorry.
ahead.
I was gonna add that like if I think back on my high school experience, because I ran cross country and track,
Hmm.
I always was comparing myself to like other runners and like my teammates, and then just wanting to fit in as well. And so I think there's a lot of pressure when you're in like middle school, high school, to fit in. And if somebody else is doing like a trendy diet or like someone's like, my mom did this, so I'm trying this, or my coach said to do this, I'm gonna try it, then that has a lot of impact.
I remember on my high school volleyball team, the girls got really into sucking on ice cubes because a calorie is a unit of heat. So if you suck on ice, obviously that means you're burning more calories. So I feel like that really planted
Yeah.
this my
Yeah.
of my
Right.
hatred of pseudoscience when you see young women trying to suck on ice to improve their caloric deficits. That's insanity, y'all.
Yeah, I totally agree. And like I've been a sports dietitian now for almost 19 years. And I would say anytime I've met with athletes, one of the first things they ask you is, so how fast can I meet this goal? Like, how fast can I get there? And so I definitely think when we talk about like the trendy diets, to your point, Zoe, whatever's quick and gets them there fastest is often what they want to do. And they're oftentimes not thinking about all of the other factors, short term consequences, long term consequences, and then obviously the psychological factors associated with it. And I have found that so many athletes will, even if they're like not even jumping on a crazy diet, maybe they start on just trying to change their body composition or get leaner or lose weight. We see that more so obviously with female athletes typically, but we see with more males now than ever.
Yeah, I mean, and
But
I think that's something that I would love to
mhm.
see more research on is like in terms of those gender differences.
Yeah,
Men are, I mean, if anything, maybe only slightly less
yeah,
prone to developing eating disorders. Their eating disorders just tend to be under-recognized and
yep,
underdiagnosed.
yep.
Men also have, and especially male athletes, have extraordinary pressures placed on them to show up in the world a
Hmm.
certain way as well, even if it's not, in the same exact body pressures that women have. There's a lot of evidence that shows that like the emphasis on building muscle mass and on like,
Yeah.
in the biggest quotation marks possible here, cutting and bulking and like eating a ton of protein and then cutting out carbohydrates to slim down and then biohacking. A lot of these
Yeah.
things are disordered eating, but just with like a
Yep.
fancy little bro hat on.
Totally agree. And we talk about like the psychological factors of that. So even if they start with a good intention, sometimes you can see like maybe they start off well and then they start, you'll start to see psychological things come in where they're either becoming obsessed with what they're eating or hyper focused on what they're eating. So let's kind of talk about from both of your perspectives, both personally, that what you've seen with clients, even Kylie and whatnot, both of you in the coaching space about what some of these psychological behaviors are that can often lead to restrictive eating, what we like to call disordered eating. Doesn't have to be a full blatant eating disorder. And then as well as how can some of those really start to hinder performance when we talk about it in the space of athletes, even just fitness people, but athletes in general.
Yeah, I think I would say like oftentimes when I'm working with high school population, I see a lot of fasting or just, not eating throughout the
Hmm.
day at
Yep.
all, or kind of, not prioritizing like a pre and post workout snack
Right.
option because I don't know if we really need carbs for our
Yep.
sport or something. And I think it's all centered around this idea of like restriction or manipulation from what I can
Hmm.
see. And that's where people like this feeling of wanting to control something. And so
Yeah.
a lot of high schoolers have a lot of stuff going on, and food is a way to kind of feel like maybe I have a little bit more control over what's going on right now. And that's where sometimes we can see slipping down into more
Yeah.
of that disordered eating or eating disorder space. And a lot of athletes that I work with in the high school athlete space are coming from disordered eating and an eating disorder space. And so kind of having to navigate that with them and get them out of that hole can be really challenging.
Yeah, and I find that so many times they don't really like recognize that those psychological behaviors and how that affects their eating really can hinder their performance. And I think that's a great lead into talking about when we talk about hindering performance, a lot of these athletes that go on trendy diets start to experience nutrient deficiencies. Like that could be really even just not consuming enough protein or enough vitamins, minerals, and then energy deficiency. They're just simply not getting enough energy, calories, whatever you want to call it, to really fuel their bodies, fuel their performance. And I always joke like lots of athletes walk around feeling not good, but they don't realize they don't feel good because not good is normal. And so let's talk a little bit about how some of these diets really affect athletes from an energy perspective. Obviously, both of you, the ultra endurance girl, like I've worked with some of those athletes before. And I mean, like energy is your friend, and if you don't have enough, it's your whole training session's going south real fast. So let's talk a
Ever
little
tried
bit
to run a
about.
marathon without enough fuel? It is not a good time.
Oh my gosh,
Would not
seriously,
recommend.
seriously. Yes. So let's kind of talk about how those trendy diets, what y'all have seen, chime in on what I have seen with your athletes in regards to what we often see them cutting out the most.
Mm. I'll say that, I'll let Kylie chime in with her experience as a nutritionist, but as a coach, I see a lot of athletes trying to minimize their carbohydrate intake or
Yep.
cut out carbohydrates with the desire to optimize their ability to oxidize fat or to burn more fat as fuel relative to carbohydrate. And particularly for female athletes, there's a lot of evidence that shows that reducing carbohydrate doesn't significantly change your ability to oxidize fat, or like just running and training and being
Mm-hmm.
healthy improves that, but restricting your carbohydrate intake, not so much. And so the downsides of doing that are enormous, particularly for women. If you have an energy deficit of really only a couple hundred calories, not only does your performance suffer, but also your like the risk of injury, the risk of like performance setbacks are significant. So we see people taking these huge gambles that like have really limited like ability to pay off, but have
Yeah.
huge amounts of evidence that show how dangerous they can be. I mean, detrimental to performance and detrimental to health. But as athletes, we often get so fixated on the bright, shiny object,
Yep.
wanting like a really small intervention to have huge results, that sometimes we can become blinded to the huge downsides of these dietary decisions.
Yeah. So you said something that I want to touch on because you talked about like in regards to reducing carbohydrate, which I think is one of the biggest things that we see in regards to wanting being leaner or whatever it is. And what's interesting about a lot of the research is that it shows that when you cut out carbohydrate for not even a crazy period of time, even like 4 to 8 weeks, that your body becomes less efficient at using it as a source of energy. So I've seen some studies done with Louise Burke and friends out of Australia Institute for Sport, and they look at, okay, you have cyclists or you have runners, and you take carbohydrate out and they think, oh, well, then I'm going to add it back in and almost use it as like a performance benefit. But their body actually doesn't, fancy science word, oxidize or use it as efficiently as it did. So you actually end up like causing more detriment to your performance. And to your point, we know that like some athletes can hang and maybe compete at the same level, but typically you do not see performance benefit when you take out carbohydrate at all. And you're way more likely, especially for the average person, to like really fall into fatigue faster, which obviously, as we know, can contribute to negative performance. Go ahead, Kylie. I know
And
you've
I
seen
like to
this a
run
ton.
fast and I like to eat pizza. And that's what the evidence supports. So,
Yes, you know what? It does. It totally, and drink some chocolate milk with it, right?
and drink
Right.
some
When you're
chocolate milk.
done.
Exactly.
Exactly. Go ahead, Kylie, with what you're going to say.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, even along those lines, I don't know if you've seen the study where they've showed that even at if you have your full energy intake for the day, even if you meet those energy requirements, but you're not getting enough carbohydrate in, that can still leave you open to increased risk for bone stress injuries. So I think one of the big trends that I see is people will do lower carb, and they don't recognize at first like the detrimental effect that that can
Hmm.
have down the line. Or even if just like you're in a general energy deficit down the line, your body's going to start like giving you signals that
Yep.
things are not working properly. So that could be through frequent injury or illness, or it could be through things that people don't realize, like even iron deficiencies, or like
Hmm.
you're like having frequent digestive issues,
Yeah.
those sorts of things. I've worked with athletes that they have no idea that like, oh, like the reason why I really can't get my iron up is because I'm not eating enough, you know? And
Yeah.
so they're just maybe taking a supplement and then masking that. And so I
Hmm.
think that's another point to kind of make, is that sometimes you don't really realize it until like it could be a year later or something.
Right. Right. Yeah. And so many times I find that athletes will complain of fatigue and they'll complain of being tired. Like, I just never have enough energy at practice. You evaluate their sleep. You're like, okay, maybe you could improve, but you're sleeping pretty good. A lot of athletes do not put two and two together, that lack of energy, not consuming enough nutrition, and fatigue go together. And many times that's why they're experiencing fatigue. They're simply not eating enough. And a lot of the athletes that we work with in my business, high school kids, college kids, they are still in a massive phase of growth and development. And so not only are they just trying to compete, their body is growing, developing, going through puberty, producing hormones, and they're trying to think and go to school and train. And I think lots of coaches, parents, athletes really sometimes underestimate how much nutrition that needs. I was looking at some menus for, I was telling y'all, motocross training facility I'm going to be looking at. And these are young boys. And I'm looking at the menus and I'm like, oh, we're going to need some extra food here because, like, young guys need so many calories and even so many young girls. And I find that I think we're seeing just a lot of issues from fatigue. You mentioned injury, just from not eating enough proper nutrition, which is crazy. And I think a lot of times athletes don't necessarily see the short term consequences of that. I think nutrition has a much more long term consequence. Like I always tease high school athletes, there's like a short term consequence to like not going to practice, showing up late. You're getting penalized, you're running, or, whatever your consequence is going to be. No massive short term consequence to not eating a snack. Maybe you don't have as much energy at practice. But to your point, Kylie, when we start looking down the road, how does that affect energy availability, bone development, injuries, etc.? So I'd love to hear both of y'all's kind of thoughts on restrictive eating and what you've seen personally in regards to the people that you work with both short-term issues and consequences and then long-term.
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons we wanted to make this podcast is like both of us were, yeah, like, participated in sports as younger folks. And now both of us work with like a lot of female clients, athletes.
Yeah.
Like I'm a coach, she's a coach and a dietitian. So seeing women who, in their 30s, 40s, and even on into their 50s are still navigating the consequences of decisions they made in their teens and
Hmm.
20s is absolutely heartbreaking
Yeah.
because in my sport of ultra running, women peak in their late 30s.
Yeah.
So I would just say to young women and young athletes, like you have so much time ahead of you, and the decisions you're making now will have impacts far into the future. And the bravest thing you can do is to invest in that future athlete because no one wants to
Love it.
peak in high school. And there are so many amazing years ahead of you. And if you don't take care of yourself the way you deserve to be taken care of now, you can be struggling with bone injuries like later into your career. You can have
Hmm.
GI issues. Like I've worked with clients who have repeated GI issues just because they didn't fuel enough when they were younger. Folks who are sort of limited in how much training volume they're able to take on, or the distances they're able to run, or just how much joy they are able to find in movement from navigating sort of disordered relationships with food and movement. And so I would say be brave and believe that your best years are ahead. And even if you aren't seeing tough downsides of these decisions now, like none of us make it out unscathed. And the love that you show yourself now is the most amazing thing you can do to set yourself up for a long-term, satisfying, career or even just relationship with
Yeah.
with food.
Yeah, and I think sometimes when I chat with high schoolers, they have a hard time, like that long term isn't something they're
Yeah.
thinking
No.
about.
Mm-mm.
Yeah, and fear tactics don't usually work either when I'm
Yeah.
chatting with them. So
Yeah.
trying to figure out, what they're motivated, what are you motivated by,
Hmm.
and some athletes like really want to go to college and do a sport.
Yeah.
And we talk about that and like what level of fueling is required to be able to like maintain yourself in sport, even just
Hmm.
at the college level. And so trying to think about that piece too, like what are your more immediate goals with your sport and trying to think about, it's not even necessarily like, yes, I agree with Zoe, like that long-term impact is really important, but even in the short term, like some of these things can happen in the next year.
Yeah.
And do you want to be able to participate in your sport within the next year?
Yeah.
So thinking in those terms too, and then remembering that that relationship to food, I think
Yeah.
is a really important point here that like it's not just food isn't just about nutrients, it's also about like enjoying and having social time with friends and
Hmm.
family and all of and creating memories. And I think too often we focus, even at the high school level, we focus so much on the like numbers and
Yeah.
the timing and all this stuff. And it just feels like really hardcore for some people. And then they go down that like restrictive eating disorder line and then it's too late and they're like, oh wow, this is going to take a lot of work to get out of this hole. And that enjoyment of food isn't there anymore. So
Yeah.
anyways, I see too many young
Yeah.
people with struggling with their relationship to their food and their bodies.
Yeah, and I love that you made the point from going from high school to college because lots of athletes do, even if it's at a small school. They want to. I was talking to my neighbors, and she wrestles. God,
Mhm.
Lord help us.
Amazing.
But and so she like even if it's at a small school, she would like to do it in college. And I will tell you, so I worked for TCU Athletics for 10 and a half years, and one of the biggest issues that I saw was the transition for female athletes from high school to college because the specifically in running in cross country
Mhm.
because the volume increases at a level they have never seen and it increases fast. And now you don't have a kitchen, you live in a dorm room and you lost your food maker, your mom, your dad, whatever. So, I mean, you take out some of that, and so I'm like, it's a lot of things at once. And you really see lots of female athletes, specifically male athletes, are just kind of confused, like, what's happening? I'm starving all the time. But female athletes start to break down. Like, I will
Mhm.
never imagine the amount of tears that I've seen in freshmen athlete females in college because they are just like, oh my gosh, like their bodies are tired. They're trying to finagle a bunch of different components. And so I always try to encourage young athletes, to your point, building those strong food relationships at home when you have a kitchen and parents and whoever that's helping you. So important so that they're able to take that into college because it just gets harder. The pressures get harder, the diets are more out there, people have comments, it's a more challenging environment. So I really like that you brought that up as a sports dietitian and then both of you as coaches. What would you say, like, for the people that are listening that are parents or coaches, because oftentimes I feel like they're blinded to some of the things because when you are involved in something, you may not always notice it like a third party person would. But what are some of the red flags that both of you see in regards to potentially trendy diets or just negative eating patterns and behaviors with food? Like, what should a parent or a coach be looking for so that when they're like, oh, I'm seeing that over and over again, maybe we need to do something, have a conversation, etc.
Yeah, I would say when an athlete maybe is like purposely skipping meals, like
Yeah.
it might not actually, I should say intentionally or unintentionally skipping meals. Like sometimes athletes are like, yeah, I always skip breakfast. I just don't have time.
Yeah.
So busy and not hungry in the morning. And then mom will be like, yeah, she's just not hungry in the morning. And I'm like, well, we still might need to work on that.
Yeah.
Um, So trying to like when you are an athlete, like your nutrition needs are so much higher that
Hmm.
you can't get away with like not fueling yourself
Right.
for most of the day. So that can be a challenging piece. And then team trips or like going to like races or games or things, and like an athlete's just like not eating or like not having the post-game snacks that are provided, or just like avoidance of nutrition, I think is something that can crop up.
Yeah.
And then like we've talked about before in this episode, like fatigue levels and just like
Yes.
not being able to like push yourself, or feeling like I've had athletes in high school feel like they're gonna pass out in like a meet or game or
Yep.
something, and that's a red flag,
Yeah.
like something's off. It could be hydration and electrolytes, but it also could be overall nutrition.
Yeah.
So, watching out for those fatigue levels, and, if a parent gets some blood work done and there's like a lot of deficiencies there, maybe not just saying like we're just going to do a supplement and not explore like, ooh, maybe there's some fueling things we need to do too. So those are just a couple of things.
Yeah. And I would say dieting in general,
Yeah.
if you have a kid or an athlete that is um dieting, always trying something new, yo-yoing back and forth between fad diets or even diets that don't seem fad-ish or seem
Hmm.
evidence-based, like dieting in general is just one of the biggest precursors to disordered eating and eating disorders. And those
Yep.
habits start really, really young. The average age that girls start thinking about their weight and dieting is 9. And that is heartbreaking to be
Yeah.
like
It's very
trying
true.
to, at the age of 9, already shrink and diminish your body rather than
Yeah.
focusing on fueling it and allowing it to do what it wants to do and to perform at its best. And just a lot of times the language of dieting can be used to sort of paper over more troubling relationships with food.
Yeah.
And dieting is so normalized in our culture that for a lot of people it may
Right.
not stand as that out of the ordinary, that your high school kid or your teammate or your friend or your sister might be dieting or just watching what
Hmm.
they're eating. And a lot of times that is a way of just papering over a more troubled relationship with food. And even if it isn't yet, a lot of times that can lead
Yeah.
to an unhealthy relationship with food or disordered eating and eating disorders.
Yeah. And I think another flag that I've seen specifically, maybe more for like coaches and athletic trainers, is if you notice an athlete's stamina just decreasing, like
Mhm.
you notice them slowing down. They used to be at the front of the pack running, now they're at the back. They can't make it through practice. I saw this numerous, I mean, high school sports, but in college sports. And an athletic trainer would come to me and be like, she used to be at the front of the line. Like she was the fastest on the team. She's lost a little bit of weight. Now she can't even, she's at the very back. And so a lot of times you'll see athletes that are really underfueled not even be able to make it through workouts. They lose their stamina, they lose their endurance because they simply just don't have enough energy. So I think for coaches out there, athletic trainers, those are some telltale signs. I've seen it, girls lose weight, they get thinner, but they get slower or less powerful, which is really interesting. And I don't think athletes put two and two together in that space. But for a coach, that can be a red flag, like, oh, something might be up here if they're really trying. It's not due to lack of trying, but they just can't get their body physically to do it. I'm sure you've both seen those types of, I can think through athletes in my head throughout my whole career that I'm like, oh, yeah, that one, up soccer, up cross
And
country, all the
sometimes it'll
things.
even lead to like a negative feedback loop of an athlete will
Hmm.
restrict their eating, so they'll perform worse and they'll think, oh my gosh, like I'm not restricting enough, or like I
Yeah,
need to exercise more,
exactly.
because so much of the
Exactly.
messaging we receive culturally is about restricting our food and looking a certain
Hmm.
way and sending a message about like this is what an athlete's body looks like. So it's often like we'll see athletes who come to us with symptoms or questions of things that to us pretty clearly seem symptomatic
Yeah.
of energy deficiency. And oftentimes the athlete will interpret that as like, I'm not working hard enough. I need to watch
Yeah.
what I eat even more. And so they'll go further and further down that rabbit hole as opposed to sort of like parachuting out of it.
Yeah.
Well, and I think, this podcast, obviously people are coming here to learn, which is
Yeah.
amazing. But I think there's actually a space where like there's a lot of coaches that might be maybe not informed as to like
Yes.
what the best nutrition is for their athletes, or even,
Hmm.
parents that are dieting themselves, and just
Yep.
kind of like watching your language around like food and weight and all those sorts of things, I think is really important to kind of look out for too.
Yeah.
I agree 100%. I was about to bring this up too, like as we're talking to coaches and parents and those population groups that oftentimes things roll off of everybody's tongue. Lots of times we might have moms or dads trying to lose weight. I've worked in the male sports world as well as the female sports world, and no offense to all the guys out there, but they just sometimes say things that roll off their tongue that in a male environment means nothing. I mean, like I would be dumbfounded when I worked in the NFL. Like the things that they would say to each other, I'm like, oh my God, that was such a female athletes. We would need a counselor in here, like right now. And so oftentimes males might, whether it's a dad, a brother, a coach, might, say something that seems like nothing to them. You might have moms, not necessarily moms or dads dieting. We're going into the new year, trendy diets 101. Everyone's looking at how they can eat better, fuel better, like lose weight, etc. So what are some of the tools that each of you use? I love to give people takeaways as to what should they be doing, saying, not saying perhaps, and how can we like foster a positive environment of communication with some of these young athletes as it relates to eating, body weight, and some of the pressures that they are dealing with on a normal basis?
I'll let Kylie speak to some of the more like athlete specific things, but I would just because dieting is so normalized in our culture and so
Hmm.
many folks of all genders and all like sort of like however you scan as a parent will be struggling with body image or struggling with dieting. And I would just recommend like if that's been a tough thing for you, welcome to the club. We have
Right,
jackets.
right.
Be like take care of yourself. And if you are able to support yourself and like maybe seek the mental health support and like sort of the
Hmm.
community support that you might need to address your own underlying issues with food, that is one of the bravest things you can do to make sure that your own challenging relationship with food doesn't get passed down to others. Because when you have that internal struggle, it's so hard to keep it
Yeah,
as much as we like to think we might be faking it and like
yeah,
passing, it's gonna come out and you don't want it to come out and start to impact your kids who you love. And so taking care of yourself and showing yourself that love and support is an amazing action you can take to love and support your kids who might be struggling
yeah,
with the same thing.
Well, and then from the athlete side, I've had to have some of my athletes that are working through eating disorder recovery in sport, they have to set boundaries with their parents too,
yeah.
I remember specifically someone where their dad was doing something called the Hunger Games, where they would go for like in the woods with his friends for like 4 days and not eat. And like she had to set this boundary with her dad,
Yeah,
just like, don't talk about this around me, please.
yeah,
Like, so if it's hard for parents to kind of keep that sort of thing to themselves, like, young athletes still have that ability to maybe set boundaries for themselves if they
hmm,
recognize that maybe this is not the best um environment, or like
right,
things you said around them that are maybe preventing them from fueling themselves
yeah,
appropriately. And just having the awareness of like, especially on social media, things that are like grand sweeping claims like detox, or like like big language that
yep,
might be a quick fix diet. Like recognition of that can be helpful just in being aware of like, okay, I don't, maybe I shouldn't go down this route when I'm looking at this new trend on TikTok.
yeah, totally. I
Also,
always
just
tease. Oh, go
don't
ahead.
take diet advice from TikTok.
Yeah, just a good rule of thumb in general. In
But
general,
yeah.
unless they have RD, registered dietitian after their
Yes.
name, then probably there are some out there on
But
TikTok. I'm
even
not one of them,
so,
but
that might
yeah,
not
true
be.
facts. True,
Yeah.
true facts. Well, and one of the things I always tell people, like, I love nutrition. I'm very passionate about it. But if what something is promising or telling you seems jaw-dropping, unbelievable, or just like bad information, like, oh my gosh, I can never eat that food again. It's so terrible for me. But nutrition's not that exciting. I mean, so I'm like, if it's jaw-dropping, like make you stop eating crazy, check your science because we're probably lacking science. And I think a lot of people fall prey to these things that, and I'm like, yeah, nothing's gonna do that. Or yeah, there's no way that could do that fast or whatever that is. So many people are in for the quick fix, but just really seeking out a professional is important. I think for parents and coaches, not being afraid to involve a therapist or a counselor for kids that might have issues, because a lot of times they might be performance related. They may not be food related. I think you mentioned that, Zoe, at the beginning, and they're being manifested as a food control issue. And so sometimes a third party person, be it a sports dietitian, a coach, a therapist, can be a really good person to add into the mix because it's someone that's not emotionally involved, which can be, I think, really, really helpful. I'm sure both of you have made, recommendations to those types of professionals. So then kind of closing out, each of you in your own space, both as a coach, as a sports dietitian, I know we probably have our top things that we tell athletes, but when we're thinking about trendy diets, body shape, how we feel, relationships with food, what would be each of yours like top takeaway that if you could tell an athlete, this is what I wish you knew, or this is what I wish you would do, what would it be?
I really believe that if you fuel, I believe, and also the evidence shows.
Right.
My belief really doesn't matter all that much, to be honest. If you treat your body right and you train hard, you will perform to your potential. And if your body looks different than what our culture says an athlete is supposed to look like, that's because the culture is wrong. Your body isn't wrong. Your body can't be wrong when you're taking care of it. And so I would just say have the courage to love yourself, have the courage to fuel yourself, have the courage to believe in your potential and knowing that there isn't a shortcut and that beating up on yourself and being mean to yourself and, restricting food intake is just not the way to reach your potential as an athlete and as a human. And you deserve
Yeah.
to reach your potential and you deserve to eat pizza.
Amen. Amen to that. And me, pumpkin bread this time of year. I always tell people, I'm like, that's my favorite dessert. You better believe I'm eating it the 6 weeks it shows up out of the year.
Technically a fruit, right?
Technically, I make it with oat flour, so it has fiber in it. No, go ahead, Kylie. What's your top thing to tell
Well, it's
athletes?
similar and it's kind of, I feel like some of this stuff, like we said, is not all that exciting, but if you
Yeah.
fuel it, you can do it. And that's been a piece of advice that I give all my athletes because, a lot of people don't have an understanding of like what their actual needs are to play this sport or run this race or whatever. And the requirements can be huge, and your perception of what that is like when you actually know how much you need, it's like, whoa, it can be eye-opening. So
Yeah.
I would encourage people, like, if you don't have that understanding, like, it's okay to like reach out to a professional and
Yeah.
try to get a grasp on what that looks like. Because if you give, kind of like Zoe was saying, if you give your body the nutrition it needs, it can adapt to your training and allow for you to perform the best of your abilities. So, just there's no magic solution, no magic pill.
It's really not. I like it. If you fuel it, you can do it. I love that because it's so true. And it really is about fueling. I always tease athletes and like, you're fueling your body to do all the things that you're asking it to do. Yes, perform and recover, but wake up, feel good, have energy, go to school, go to work, and whatever it is, like, really working with like all the things that you're doing. And that demands energy. And especially if you're going to enjoy what you're doing, it really does demand a lot. So I like it. If you fuel it, you can do it. All right. Y'all have been awesome. So tell everyone where they can find you. We have lots of things to find. Where can they find you on social media? Kylie, how do they find your book that's coming out? How do they subscribe to your podcast? And we're going to drop it all in the show notes, but let's just get it out there so that y'all can tell everyone how to find you and the podcast.
You can find Your Diet Sucks on social media at Your Diet Sucks Pod, and you can get us wherever you get your podcasts.
Perfect.
Subscribe so that you get the updates when it's fresh in your feed.
Yeah. And then I'm at Fly Nutrition 3 on Instagram. I do a lot of running and endurance specific nutrition content. And then my book, Practical Fueling for Endurance Athletes comes out March 3rd, 2025. So it's
Perfect.
on pre-order right now. And yeah, Fly Nutrition is my website as well.
Flynutrition.com.
Oh, sorry, flynutrition.org is my
Okay, there we go. So flynutrition.org. You can pre-order the book. I'm going to assume at a link in bio on Instagram, there's
website.
probably a
Yep,
link to that as well. All right. Say
yep.
your Instagram one more time.
Fly Nutrition 3.
Fly the number 3.
The number 3. Yes.
Fly Nutrition 3. All right. So check out Kylie's book coming out in March. Perfect time to fuel. It's going to be nice and sunny. Days getting longer. You can all be running outside. And then be sure to check out, follow their podcast, subscribe. I love podcasts that are called Your Diet Sucks, but are talking about science and evidence. Like, that's fantastic. And kudos to y'all for doing that, putting out the information and really trying to come at it with a science-backed background so that we're helping educate people. Love you both. Thank you for being on the show today.
Thanks
Thank
so
you.
much.